Hello and welcome to Tennessee Football's practice field. I'm Ren Sylvia, this is Noah Taylor. We are with VolReport.com on the Rivals Network. And we just got to talk with Tennessee Football head coach Josh Heupel and players McCallum Castles and Bryson Eason. So let's jump right into our takeaways. Noah, what's the biggest takeaway from what Heupel had to say?
I think it was when he was asked about the receivers, because we got to see a little bit of that rotation, which we probably expected to see against Austin Peay a few weeks ago. We didn't. Whether it was the score, Tennessee being up 31-0 at halftime, and also, having Brew McCoy come out of the game, Ramel Keaton come out of the game at one point. We got a chance to see some guys like Caleb Webb and Chaz Nimrod, make an impact. Obviously, Webb getting his first career touchdown in that game. He seemed very impressed with what those guys brought, and I think, even alluded to wanting to see a little bit more of them, here in the coming weeks. Depending on what happens with that receiving room this week, what it looks like. We didn't get any word on that today, but expect those guys to play a little bit more maybe down the road. But gave a really good sample size on Saturday against UTSA, and Heupel seemed genuinely impressed with what they had brought.
Yeah, really good experience for guys like Caleb Webb and Chaz Nimrod, kind of getting in the fold.
Yeah.
Guys that maybe won't be the starters this year, but kind of if you look at the future of the position, are definitely the guys that are expected to step up and be the next guys to make a big impact at wide receiver at Tennessee. Josh Heupel also talked about last year, of course, asked a lot about that disappointing loss in Columbia last year to South Carolina. Well, he says, every week is its own week. Last week doesn't affect this week, so certainly last year doesn't affect this upcoming week. Of course, you have to think it's a little bit of coach talk, and the players kind of had similar sentiments, but I do believe them to a certain extent that they are taking this one game at a time and really don't want to ruminate on the loss from last year and let it be a distraction, but instead make sure they're taking care of business for what's ahead of them this year. But the players had similar comments. McCallum Castles obviously wasn't on the team last year, but has heard a little bit about that loss. And then Bryson Eason, a guy that was on the team, what did you think about what they had to say about that game?
Yeah, asked, McCallum about it, because like you said, he wasn't here last year. Obviously a transfer from UC Davis this season. But a little bit interested in what his perspective has been like. I asked him, is that something the guys have talked about in the locker room since he arrived? We were on the podcast this morning. We said we kind of expected them to give those answers. Yeah. And he said, he was aware of how that game ended, certainly. How could he not be? But the big word that he said, or the phrase that he used and Bryson Eason used was, we wanted to be the best team on the field this Saturday. So, like you said, what we expected. It's hard to believe that they haven't thought about that game, that it hasn't been in the back of their minds. But an interesting perspective for a guy that wasn't here last year. And then Bryson Eason was. He played in that game. And he talked about it as well, being the best team on the field on Saturday. And so they definitely downplayed it, but I do think that's something that's probably been on their minds.
And Bryson Eason, also talking about that game, was asked if they're watching film from last year in that game to try to correct themselves. He said no, they're watching what South Carolina's done to this point this season. A lot of familiar faces in a guy like Spencer Rattler, South Carolina's quarterback, still on the roster. But they're focused on what South Carolina is doing this year. Of course, some different coordinators as well as going to change up some things. So they're watching film from this year instead. Bryson Eason said, of course, they watched that game last year. They didn't just flush it and completely move on. But the focus right now is how South Carolina's looked against Mississippi State last week, how South Carolina's looked against Georgia, and then, of course, how they looked against UNC in the opener. So it'll be interesting to see what Tennessee does with South Carolina and how that game plays out with these emotional factors at hand and how they can kind of focus. That'll be all from us today. Tomorrow, we'll be back right here talking to some assistant coaches and players and giving you guys more of a recap. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel to stay up to date with all of our content. We had the podcast this morning, so make sure you check that out. And we'll be talking to Alan Cole of the Gamecocks rival site coming up soon as well. So make sure you hang out for that. And over to VolReport.com for all of our written content. Hop in the message board. We've had some great discussions there as well. Links to everything you need is in the description. Thank you for watching.